Okay, I understand then that it's okay for us to continue. So with that, let's see the agenda points of today. So we will going to briefly present the introduction of the project, so how the collaboration between us, Impact Institute, and the Walton Family Foundation started, what are the research goals of this project, and the research questions that were addressed. We will then touch upon the methodology, the main activities, and of course dive deep into the results. We will then touch upon what recommendations and conclusions arise from all of this project. And later on, we will leave some space, of course, for open discussion and Q&A. So just as a reminder, just type your question in the chat as soon as something pops up in your mind. So let's move to the collaboration between us and the foundation. So we have been collaborating together to gain actionable information for decision-making and anything related to the strategy development required to support and preserve fishery communities. If we dive deep into, or if we specify the research goals and questions for this assessment, we see that there are two main research questions. So first, we have how does the value of blue swimming crab accrue throughout the supply chain? And then we have a second research question, what is the fisher share of the final product? So throughout our analysis and data collection, we have always tried to maintain a focus on the fishermen. With this, there are three main goals that arise. So the first goal is to identify the value distribution per supply chain step in the fishery. The second goal is to determine the presence of under-earning faced by fishermen. And the third goal is to understand the role of sustainable fishing in the value distribution of supply chains. With that, let's see what were the project activities. So there were five main activities from scoping to reporting. In this presentation, we will briefly touch upon each of them since it's the basis of this assessment. So first, we start with scoping exercises to limit or to set boundaries of the project. This is done based on data availability, feasibility, and when we refer to scoping, of course, we refer to not only geography and time, but also value chain structure. The second activity is with regards to data collection. So since this is of course the main element of any analysis, we will of course touch upon that later. But this analysis has been exclusively based on secondary data, so we have not been involved in any sort of primary data collection. More about that later. The third activity is to build a model. So based upon both the scoping decisions and the available data collected, we have built a financial model to quantify and estimate the value generated at each step of the value chain. Next is the analysis and validation step. So once all of the data is collected, processed, and validated, and it's fed into the model, the output is, of course, the value at each step. So with this information, we are able to provide an answer to the research questions and goals that we mentioned before. And lastly, the results are compiled and analyzed in a final report, and of course, presented here in this webinar today with all of you. I see that there are people still entering now. We have started, but no discussion into the results. So it's good. Okay, moving into the next discussion point. This is how we have approached the value chain structure. This is part of the first activity mentioned before, which is in terms of scoping. So of course, we understand, and it's important to take into consideration that the reality on the ground in the fishery is very dynamic and variable, as of course all of you know, since you are the experts. So what does that mean? This means that the value chain steps are not always clearly defined. So fishermen can sometimes steam the crab, collectors can sometimes own the mini plants. So this creates various ways of approaching a value chain in this fishery. So this was, of course, a challenge in our research. as different sources and different organizations define and discuss the fishery in very differently, right? So with that acknowledged, we have broken down or unstructured the value chain as we see on the slide now. So it consists in 8 main steps, 4 that occur within Indonesia and 4 that occur in international spaces. So of course, the first step is at the fisher level. Fishers use different types of gear, as we all know. We have identified traps, gill nets, and trawls. Fishers can be multi-day fishers or daily fishers. The next step in the value chain is the collectors, which are intermediary agents that finance fishers' operations. And they are in charge of steaming the crab before selling it to the mini plants, who are in charge of picking out the meat. Mini plants are usually independent and locally owned enterprises. The mini plants, of course, sell the meat or the picked meat to processing facilities where they prepare the product for final exportation. We, of course, highlighted 2 main organizations at this level. So the APRI at the processor level and the NFI Crab Council at the distributor level, since I think almost 85%, if I remember correctly, of the packed blue swimming crab is exported to the US. Other markets are based in Asia and Europe. This would then mean that the 4 last steps, so distributors, retailers, consumers, and disposal, are, as mentioned before, not based in Indonesia. If we move to the next step in our assessment, was to determine the scope within the value chain. So here we focused on Indonesia. So our geographic scope is Indonesia. This means that our assessment consists in analyzing the first 4 steps from fishers to processors. Other scoping considerations is that we are focusing only on daily fishers. This is because multi-day fishers have a more complex dynamics in the fishery. They, of course, go to the sea for 5 or more days and they steam the crab on board and they sell directly to mini plants. And due to data availability, our assessment is exclusively focused on daily fishers. As mentioned before, trawl is also a gear that is used, but it's not in scope. This is, of course, given that it's banned from the industry. This does not mean, however, that fishers might use this gear. But we have based our analysis on gear, based on the gear in terms of gill net and trap. And lastly, fishers have blue swimming crab as the only source of income. Of course, we are aware that in reality, there are other sources of income, especially and not in the peak season, with other work or inclusive other income from family members. However, based on data availability, again, this has been going to be stressed a lot throughout this presentation. It was not possible to account for these other sources of income. The same goes for collectors, in fact. Another scoping element that's not in the slide, but it's in terms of the year of the assessment, that is 2019, so pre-COVID. If we move to the next step in our project activities, we will talk about data collection. So as mentioned previously, we have been using exclusively secondary data. And the goal when conducting this type of research is to use, of course, sources that have similar scope. But it had happened that for a specific data point, there is no available data with a similar scope. So this data hierarchy that we see in the left hand of the slide provides a ranking of data characteristics to decide which data point is best suited for the data indicator that we're dealing with. We see as well that different scoping elements are related to geographical scope or time period. Of course, to get the most comprehensible overview possible of the industry, we reviewed and studied multiple reports shared by the foundation, which allowed us to understand in detail the dynamics, the complex dynamics of the fishery, and collect as well various data points. Other data has been collected from different studies, sector reports, national statistics, academic papers. Examples of data sources are in the slide, and we can share a complete list of references later on. Starling Resources, Blue-Green Advisors, Global Marine Commodities. From all of these papers, we have been able to recover data points related to the selling price of mini plants, the selling price at collectors, the export price, relevant information at the fisher level for the Blue-Green Advisors especially. And from the global marine commodities, we have found a lot of relevant information at the cost level for mini plant and cooking. This, of course, poses some limitations in the type of data that we have found. So looking at the time, I think I'm going to just condense the information a little bit so we have time for discussion. But the three main limitations is related to imperfect data, lack of sustainability data, unknown analysis of underpayment. Imperfect data relates, of course, to the fact that there were relatively old data points that we had to adapt to be able to incorporate, and that are very highly dependent on location. And the second factor is as well, and related to this, is the fact that strong assumptions had to be made to actually make use of the data points and stretch them out. So yeah, this is of course important to take into account when interpreting the results. Second limitation is the lack of sustainability data. We will talk about this more since it's related to the third role of the assessment. And the third limitation is related to the lack of analysis of underpayment. This was originally within the scope of the assessment. However, again, due to data availability, we had to focus on under-earning exclusively. So the main difference here is basically under-earning, independent actor, independent fisher earning their own income versus underpayment related to relationships between fishers and potential employers. Next step in terms of project activities, we have the model development, which is based on a financial analysis to determine the value generated at each step of the value chain from fishers to processors. The focus is, of course, set on the revenue and expense level within each player in the chain. And the income analysis is determined to obtain and estimate the amount of profit obtained in each node. So this profit is understood as the value generated within each node. Basic equation used was profit equals total cost minus, total revenue minus total cost, in which profit is obtained, of course, when total revenue is higher than total costs. For fishers, we have conducted this analysis separately between gears, as mentioned before, so gill nets and traps, and wherever possible, we have included data with regards to seasonality of the fishery. Just as a reminder, please take into consideration that no other sources of income are included, again, due to data availability. What's the output of the model? So as you can see in this little visual, from the scoping, the sourcing of secondary data, and the model developed, everything is plugged into our calculation tool, and this provides an output. The output of this is the value earned in dollar per kilo per each of the value chain steps. So in order to create an equal comparison of results, the values were adjusted with quantity ratios to capture the proportion of the original crab into the final product. And the results, as we will see in a bit, are displayed per can of blue steaming crab. We decided to do this so that it would be a little bit more, to grasp more in terms of what actually a can is instead of per kilo. A can is more or less, I think, between 400 grams, or that's what we used to display the results. So now that we have a clear understanding of the methodology applied and all of the steps taken, let's dive right into the first goal of the project, which is to understand the value distribution of blue steaming crab. Okay, so here we see the main results of the project, where we see that fishers earn $2.48 net per can of blue steaming crab, whilst collectors make a loss, as we see here, of 62 cents. Mini plants and processors earn approximately 90 cents and almost $2.5 respectively. This adds up to a total value of 5.13, so just above $5 per can being retained in Indonesia. A standard can of blue swimming crab is sold at international markets and retailers for an average selling price of $17. Of course, it depends on where it's actually sold and the quality of the crab. What does this mean is that the difference in this value from 5 to 17 is that the value is accrued in the steps of the value chain that are not within this analysis, so that are not within Indonesia. This relates to from importers to consumers. If we continue with the presentation, we see what or how these results can be translated in relative terms. So this would mean that fishers retain 48% of a value of a can. Collectors would make a loss of 12%. Mini plants would retain almost 17%, and processors would retain 47%. If we continue, we will see the net income breakdown for collectors, mini plants, and processors. So here we see exactly the revenue, the costs, and the net income that generates at each step of the value chain post-harvesting level. We see that collectors make a loss of 53 cents. The cost of collectors here include the cost of produce, so the cost of the crab they buy from the fishers, as well as the cost of cooking. The costs at the mini plant level not only include the picker fee and the cost of ice, but also, of course, the cost of buying the steamed crab from the collectors. This results for the mini plants a total net income of almost just above $2 per kilogram of picked meat. Finally, at the processor level, we see that the value generated is $5.66 net per kilo final product. Again, the final product here is understood as the processed, pasteurized, packed final product of the blue swimming crab ready for export. And the costs at this level include the cost of buying picked meat and an estimation for the cost of processing. So we are aware that stating that collectors make a loss of 12% or that they make a loss of 50 cents per kilo is quite surprising, given that some reports state that, in fact, collectors earn twice as much as fishers. So why is this happening? So let's recall that the role of collectors is, of course, highly dependent, not only on the location of the fishery or of the fishing site, on traditions, but also it have different settings in the value chain. So as we were mentioning before, right, it might be the case that fishers perform the boiling and sell straight to mini plants. However, it may also be the case that collectors are in fact owners of the mini plant. So let's see how results would look like if this would indeed be the case. When combining collectors and mini plants, as we see on the slide, we see that together they accrue a positive value of 24 cents per can of blue swimming crab. This does not mean, however, that this step of the value chain accrues the lowest. So something that we need to take into consideration when analyzing or interpreting these results is that the amount of crab that is managed at each node of the value chain varies drastically. So the total kilograms of catch per day at a fisher level cannot be compared with the amount of crab that a collector or a mini plant manages. So collectors or mini plants receive the daily catch from many, many fishers. Hence, the fact that fishers retain as well 48% or $2.48 per can is not so much a matter of price, but related more to the yield. If we combine these results of collectors and mini plants, we share that together they accrue a value of almost 5%. Of course, the value at the fisher and processor level remains unchanged. That is almost 48 and 47 respectively. Given the focus on fishermen livelihood and their economic well-being, let's now turn the discussion to their situation in the fishery. And I'm sure the discussion on collectors will be very popular in our discussion. So let's move now to the fishermen. So as discussed earlier, we focused exclusively on trap and gillnet fishers. As we see here in the graph to the right, we see that the yearly average income for trap fishers is consistently higher across provinces. I think I didn't mention this earlier in the scoping slide, but we have focused on 4 provinces, Lampung, Central Java, East Java, and West Java. I will see below. This is based again due to data availability and to stick with current use of the data in several reports that we have seen, that the focus was on these 4 provinces. So we see that the average yearly income for trap fishers is slightly above $2,000 per year, as compared to gillnet fishers, which is approximately 1,700. This is also based on the fact that there are 76% of fishers that use trap, and the remaining 24 use gillnet. Again, we are aware that this distinction between gears is highly dependent on year, location, or source used. So this is something as well that we can touch upon later. So why is this happening? Why are trap fishers earning more? What can the data that we collected tell us about these differences? So we can see that the yield of the blue swimming crab caught using traps is higher, as seen in the graph to the right, across provinces. We can see as well that Lampung and West Java seem to have higher yields as compared to Central and East Java. To the left, or at the center of the slide, we also see several main statistics that are also interesting. So the average yield per trap, and as well the fishing time. It's interesting to see that trap fishers spend on average 324 more hours per year fishing than gillnet fishers. And as researched, we believe this is due to entanglement with coral or hard objects, which requires time for amending the gear. If we continue, we will see what type of costs the fishers incur. So what we have incorporated based on data availability in the fixed costs are the costs of the gear, either trap or gillnet, and the buckets. And for variable costs, we have included the renting of the boats, the fuel costs, and the use of baits. We can see here that the fixed costs are higher for gillnets than for traps. This is because the price per gillnet is relatively high as compared to the price per trap. And the variable costs, in turn, are higher for trap fishers than for gillnet fishers, given the use of bait for trap fishers. So combining this information, when we talk about net income in terms of dollar per kilo, as we see here, trap fishers earn more in Central and East Java on a per kilo basis, while gillnet fishers earn more in Lampung and West Java. Now that we have a clear understanding of the fisher's soul, and also looking at the time, it's time to move to the second goal of the research project, which is to capture the presence of under-earning in the fishery. So we see here the living income, net income distribution of blue swimming crab fishers in Indonesia for our year of analysis, 2019. The main takeaway is that the median income of fishers is 18% below the living income for a rural family. This is, of course, based on this estimation on the median income that we see here. So it's 1,550. It's based on the resulting average of our analysis of the fishers, which is 1,965. And we compare this with the rural living income, which is the yellow box at the bottom. We see that it's set at 1,000, slightly above 1,900. What does the structure, we can talk about this more in detail in the presentation, but we see that it's slightly skewed to the right. And this is due to the fact that there are many more fishers that earn very little and there are very few fishers that earn a lot. We see as well that the national poverty line and the World Bank poverty line are, of course, lower, that the median is, of course, higher than these two indicators, but of course, there's still under earning in the industry and the fishery. If we go back to our estimations of our analysis, we see that 61%, in fact, of fishers earn below the living income for a rural family in Indonesia. This is seen here in the red highlighted piece of the graph. So this means that the remaining 39 would then earn above the living income. Moving to our last goal of the assessment, that is the role of sustainable fishing. We wanted to provide an answer to what is the role of sustainable fishing in the value distribution. Unfortunately, due to data limitations and availability, we were not able to incorporate that in our analysis. So for instance, we are aware, as mentioned before, of the several mechanisms in place by the government in terms of the prohibition of the using of the trawl, prohibition of catching egg-bearing females and small crabs. We have found several data points with regards to percentages of this type of prohibited catch, so females and small crabs. However, it's also hard to actually measure or to include in the analysis the degree to which this amount of crab is actually returned back to the sea, as the regulation would mandate. We are aware that mini plants might seem or might be less encouraged or are less involved in the compliance of state or industry sustainability regulations. So it is quite common to find prohibited catch being picked and processed for packaged product. In terms of sustainable fishing, however, we have indeed been able to portray several insights into fishers' income, as seen in the slide before. So what does this all mean? We have shown our results, which were based on the best available data out there. And if we move to the next point of the presentation, we'll talk about the recommendations. So we are, of course, aware that the reality on the ground is changing, also based on the investments and several efforts that all of you are, of course, implementing, and other stakeholders as well. So we are moving towards the right direction. Based on this idea that there are current efforts being taken, we have 3 recommendations that are, of course, interconnected, similar, but related to different levels in terms of stakeholder and value chain. So first of all, when we talk about increasing collaboration and knowledge sharing, this is really pointing towards the organizations that are working on monitoring, such as all of you, and at the APRI level. So the idea is if we could work together to create a common language to speak in common, so that modeling, monitoring, anything that is related to data especially, can be done on a more regular level, and we can discuss and interpret results in the same dimension in terms of the value chain structure, for instance. Of course, this is important to take into consideration the different nuances that are on the ground. We believe that this will go a long way into better understanding what is happening on a daily basis in the fishery and how to use the results of this analysis to further support the development of the fishery. Second, and this is more related to the value chain, at the value chain level, we would like to promote more traceability. Of course, we are aware that this is already a very important point in your agenda and that there are many efforts being done with this in the fishery, but nevertheless, we believe it's important to stress here as well. Traceability would help increase the collaboration and knowledge sharing at each step, but also create more clarity within the value chain itself when discussing where the value is going, and in many other applications not related to this research as well. Third, in combination with the previous points, progress towards a living income, as we have seen, 61% of fishers earn below a living income. So it's important to stress here as well. As a mean, and the means to do this is through chain-based interventions. So the more we increase our understanding of the fishery dynamics and the more we work on traceability throughout stakeholders, we would increase the value, monitoring, sustainability, of course, all of relevant aspects that are aligned with the efforts to achieve the sustainability certification that the fishery is working towards. So what does this mean in terms of a conclusion for this research project? We are coming, where are we coming? from what we have seen from this research. So we, of course, are coming from a highly variable and understudied fishery. It's important to stress, of course, that the international market for blue swimming crab has only been around for approximately 25 to 30 years, at least in Indonesia, where we are now. So large amounts of research, of course, have been invested from local governments to private actors. Partnerships have been formed. However, as mentioned previously, there are still major data gaps and incomparability of data, which are key to transform analysis into actionable insights. We feel that in the future, based on the previous recommendations, it would be important to get everyone to speak a common language and share a common vision. So this can lead to sustained progress throughout the fishery. So with that, thank you very much as well for everyone who's here, but especially for Starling Resources and Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, which we have been in contact with since the beginning for this assessment, and they have helped sharing data resources, helping us understand the world of the blue swimming crab, as well as validating some of our analysis. So with that, thank you very much for your attention and your interest for being here. And with that, let's move to the discussion and Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much, Susanna, for that presentation. I'd like to remind everyone to please put their questions in the chat, and then we can go through each of those when they come up. So there's one question already from Desi. Can you remind us again where you get the data of this net income per province? So that's on the side with the deep dive into the fishers value generation. I don't know if you know that answer by heart, Susanna.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I don't think that we have that off the top of our head. We of course have a very extensive model that we've built all of this from. We can absolutely share the sources that we use to come to this, and maybe just an individual consultation if you want to reach out to us, or we can send you an email with maybe a bit more of an in-depth answer. Off the top of my head, I don't know each individual data point because we've had to collate data points from different sources to come to these kinds of conclusions. But we'll be happy to share more information maybe outside of this discussion in terms of what specific data points came from what specific resource.
Yeah, thank you. Then Aditya said, I'm just joining the presentation. Grateful if you could inform what is the number of the sample and how many sites in each province where the research conducted.
Yeah, maybe a bit of the same answer as to the previous question, unfortunately, but so we split up into these provinces based on some of the secondary data that was already available. So we had mentioned some of the sources before, but I think at the end here we have a more complete list of, yeah, here's the list of our references. Basically, we have made the most complete analysis possible based on the information found in here. So for example, with the State of the Fishery Report 2021 from Blue Green Advisors, we pulled some data points from, I think, 5 sites in Lampung, but there were different number of sites per province, and each report also had different methodologies to come to the conclusions that they did in whatever given report. And this is also getting back to what we were saying and why our recommendations were so again and again talking about data availability and the conclusions that we can draw from this, is that it was extremely difficult to make this kind of analysis because we had data from different years. I mean, the fishery is changing very quickly. Of course, now with COVID, things have changed even more. We have data from different years, from different provinces, talking about the value chain in different ways, and giving sometimes there was data points which we felt were really outliers, which didn't match with other data points that we were seeing. So we had to make some difficult decisions about, okay, does this make sense, or is the data point reported here an outlier, specifically for this site for some reason that we as analysts, working from the Netherlands, don't have the background in to make a decision on. So for every data point that we pulled, to make the long story a little bit short, for every data point we pulled, we had the best possible logic based on what we were seeing in other sites, what we were seeing in other reports, and adjusted data as much as possible to be reasonable within the context of what we knew about the fishery.
Yes, thanks, Victor. And also just to clarify, because I see, of course, that your question is more in terms of number of the sample and how many sites per province. And just to clarify that, of course, we did not do any sort of sampling strategy, given that no primary data was collected. Just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah, thank you. Then we have some comments from Desi. So I think, thank you for those comments, Desi. We will, for instance, in slide 14, we can include also the fisheries there. There's no problem. Then there's a question why interviews weren't included from fisheries directly. Yeah, so I think that's really about the scope of this project. So what we try to do is as good as possible make estimations of the value based on secondary literature and conversations with different partners, and including interviews with fishers would of course have been great, but that was not part of the scope of this project. Then one comment on the value distribution slide. Let's see, value distribution slide. That mentioned the dollar per can of BSC at the fishers level is slightly high than the processor.
Is this the one that's being referred to, or?
I'm not sure.
Might be this one.
I can maybe jump in. I believe I understand your point, which is so the dollar per can is higher at the fisher level than at the processor level, and this is contradictory with the situation that we see on the ground, since fishers seem to complain about the instability of prices. Then again, this is very important to understand where we come from. Of course, many comments related to the data collection. There was no primary data collection, which have, of course, shown a much more enriched discussion or analysis to the questions being posed in this project. So it's important to also understand that the data or the results displayed here are based on a snapshot of what secondary research shows us, right? So at least, yeah, just important to take that into consideration. The fact that fishers earn or retain 2.48 per can does not mean by any means that they earn more than processors, right? So this is important here as well to remember the amount of the quantity of crab that fishers manage, which might be 5 kilos per day, for instance, versus the amount of processors, of the amount of crab that processors manage on a daily basis, which is way, way, way higher, right? So again, this is not, of course, by any means saying that the price is constant and stable, but this reflects the reality based on an estimation of the reality based on secondary data.
Yeah, and maybe in response to Desi's last input, so based on our experience, collectors and mini plants are always much better off than fishers. I think that's in the same line as what Susanna just mentioned. So this is really per can of BSC, meaning that if you handle a lot of cans per hour or per labor hour, for instance, you can of course earn a lot more still than what is being earned at the fisher level. So that should be taken into account here. Then there's a question, do you also consider the volatility of the BSC prices that might vary every year?
Yeah, I can jump in on this. So the prices, of course, we have to in our data processing, we have to give a price to what we consider the price of a kilo of blue swimming crab, just because of the way the model is built. Where possible, we've used secondary data sources to do so. Where not possible, we've had to use World Bank inflation rates to take data from a particular given year and then inflate it to another year. We are aware that this is not always a fully accurate representation of the reality on the ground, which is why I think our larger message in general here has not been that, okay, this is exactly what is happening, but this is what the secondary data shows based on what reports exist. And this is the best estimation that can be made at the moment. And that, which is why, of course, our recommendations are also mostly based on getting more comparable data that then can be equally taken from one step to the next to make a more informed analysis. Which is really what the outcome of this project has largely been.
Yeah, thank you for that. Of course, all of your input, we will take into account everything you put into the chat today. Is there any more questions on this research?
I see that Irham made a comment on collectors, and I thought it would be interesting to just follow up on that comment. Irham, thank you for posting. So of course, collectors, as we were mentioning before, it's very controversial that we state that collectors make a loss. So first of all, again, important to take those results with care and taking into account all of the limitations within the data collection, but also to understand what the role of these collectors is, right? We have seen several other sources that we can share, of course, and I think I might remember the title or at least the organization behind it, that stated that the profit margin for at the collector level was close to zero, so between 0.2 and $0.5 per kilo. So it's important also to understand that the value here is understood as the profit earned. So in terms of higher prices in terms of collectors and fishers, that of course is the case, right? But here we're focusing on the value. The fact that the result of our profit at the collector level is close to zero, is negative, might reflect as well the lack of data at the collector level. There is much more data at the fisher level, because of course that is of interest for everyone. The collector might have a similar value as well to research, but perhaps the research there is a bit more lacking. We had so it's important as well to understand that where we're going towards this is that it's our results are not that different, let's say, as to other research where the profit per kilo at the collector level is close to zero. So again, this is related to data limitations and lack of research as well at the collector level.
Yeah, thank you very much for that addition. Yeah, so Desi mentions perhaps it will be better, will help to add the number of fishers and the number of collectors, mini plants, processors, so we can see the average value distribution per individual. I know if Victor or Susanna, you want to respond to that?
Off the top of my head, I don't recall to what level of detail we have for each of these value chain steps. Susanna, you might have a better remembrance of what exactly we have in the model in terms of this question.
Right now, of course, I do not remember exactly, but Desi, we will process your comment and integrate this into the final report if we see fit. Thanks.
Perfect. Any other questions or comments? Then maybe Leo, does your sound work? Would you like to
I
wrap
don't think
up?
so. I hope you can hear me. I was just curious if you could share the timing or the timeline for the publication, given that we may see still a few incorporating some of the feedback you received here today.
Yes, of course. So we are now wrapping up this report and wanting to publish it in the next few months, but it's also really dependent on how fast everything goes. But indeed, your input would be very much valued, and we will take into account everything that is here now. But let's say for the next 2 weeks, you can send further inputs to the email address that Susanna put in the chat. So susanna@impactinstitute.com. And then we can still take that into account towards our final report.
Got it. I don't see any other questions, so I'll just share my appreciation for the people in Indonesia that have joined, and the US as well, that have joined this webinar. I know it's in the evening for most, and I'm thankful for the feedback that everyone has provided. It's been constructive. It's something that the foundation is to continue to learn what information can we collect, what information can we rely on from secondary sources, and what could the next stage of this type of research look like if we were to incorporate primary data sources. It's something that is still evolving, and we appreciate all the feedback and insights. And I'm looking forward to seeing so many of you, or if not all of you, in a month or so.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Leo. And thanks from our side as well, of course, to everyone. Have it be a morning or evening. Thank you so much for joining, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for everyone.